Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. My name is Ana Rojas, and it is my pleasure to be your moderator today for Understanding Power Project Finance, our latest webinar under Increasing Connections, which is brought to you by the Women in African Power Network. I want to thank the participants for joining, as well as our panelist of today. And I also want to thank Power Africa, which is a US government-led partnership coordinated by USAID because of their support to the network and the possibility of making this webinar brought to you. Before we get started with today's webinar, I just want to run you through some virtual housekeeping matters. First, you've noticed that participants are being kept on mute during the webinar, and this is to avoid disturbances and to ensure ease of transmission of the webinar. This doesn't mean that you keep quiet or that we expect you to keep quiet through the webinar. All the contrary, if you look towards the right part of your screen, you will see that there is a box that has a chat function. Please do share your questions and comment with us so that we can refer to them during the question and answer section of this webinar. When you are sending your questions or comments, please be both brief, but provide us with sufficient context when you're asking your questions so that it's easier for our panelists to understand what is the objective and the information that you're looking for. So do keep that in mind. My colleague Maria Prebles is behind the scenes, and she would be monitoring the chat box. Also, if you're experiencing technical difficulties, which I am sorry to say has been the case for many of you today. So please do reach out to her and bear with us if technology fails us. As I said, she would also be collecting the questions that you put to the chat box and help us monitor the conversation during today's webinar. As this is a series, I would just like to share with you that our upcoming webinar would be on power purchase agreements, and that would be towards the end of next month. So do also keep track of our information. Availables would also be handouts, particularly on the network, in the box towards your right. And as this is the question that we always get asked, yes, this webinar is being recorded, and it's recording as well as the PDF versions of the presentations that you're going to see today will be made available to you shortly after the webinar. And without further ado, I would like to, just for those of you who are not so familiar with us, the Women in African Power Network, the network convenes and connects established and emerging female leaders who are working in the African energy sector. At the moment, we have members in more than 20 African countries and a membership that's over 600 members. They have a diversity of backgrounds, and this includes women and men working in national utilities, working on energy finance, being part of NGOs, engineers, or they're studying at the university. If you want to know more about us or follow us, these are the social platforms that you can find us at. And if you want to become a member of Women in African Power, you're not one yet, please do reach out to Denise Mortimer at the email that you see below. Today's webinar has been designed so that participants are introduced to Power Africa's Understanding Power Project Finance Handbook. The handbook is intended to provide its readers with an overview of the structure of private investments and financing for energy projects, including sources of finance and key stakeholders. This presentation would be further supported and accompanied by presentations from 2 Women in African Power members with experience in the financing of energy projects. As you can see, they come from banks, but very different stakeholders in terms of the relation and the manner that investments are allocated and interests are assessed. So we will be hearing from Rantje van Tonder from Standard Bank in South Africa and from Lucy Chege from the Development Bank of Southern Africa in terms of how it is that they experience and they interact also in terms of financing energy projects. The end of our presentation of the webinar would have a question and answer session, as I said before. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to the first of our speakers, Ms. Vibhuti Jain from Power Africa. She's going to be providing the presentation and introduction to the handbook. And Vibhuti Jain leads the financial solutions team at Power Africa and is a WiAP member. She is from New York and is based in Johannesburg. Prior to working with Power Africa, she worked as a broker dealer and investment as a corporate lawyer with in the US. She is an author of Understanding Power Project Finance Handbook. And Vibhuti, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, just bear with me while okay, great. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you for that introduction, Anna. As Anna mentioned, I'm with Power Africa, and hopefully those of you on the line are familiar with what Power Africa is and are familiar with Women in African Power, so I won't start with that. What I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about one of the motivations for having this webinar. So Power Africa, as Anna mentioned, is a US government-led program to increase energy generation and access, and one of the things we focus on is how we can build technical capacity in power project financing, or just power finance in general. And power project finance had consistently come up as an area where there were often gaps in experience and where we were often confronted with parties at a negotiation who felt like they didn't have the necessary background on why a deal was being structured in a particular way, and the different financing options and credit and risk credit enhancement and risk allocation instruments available to them. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the handbook. So the Understanding Power Project Finance Handbook is essentially a book that was drafted by about 15 or 16 sector experts in power project finance, from the private sector, from African governments, from the development sector, and when I say development sector, I mean technical assistance agencies, development finance institutions, including multilateral institutions. And the book was drafted in just a week's time using a patented technology called the book sprint method. Was written back in 2016, and it came about because during the course of our work at Power Africa, we were often asked questions about what best practices were in power project finance, particularly from the African public sector, specifically in countries that may not have had a thriving IPP market before, or may have never negotiated an IPP, or were considering introducing that framework into their country, and wanted to understand what are the basic concepts, ideas, and negotiation points we need to be aware of. So I think there's probably varied skill levels in terms of fluency in project finance on this webinar, so I'm not going to teach anyone the specific concepts so much as I am going to highlight what some of the principles were that we discussed in the book, and then I'm going to encourage you all, should you be interested, in downloading a copy and either using it for your own knowledge or sharing it with colleagues, and also feeling free to use it as as a resource for doing your own trainings. It's all available under the Creative Commons license, and so we encourage use of this information. So the Power Project Finance book that was drafted, just very briefly, is part of a series. There's also a predecessor book on understanding power purchase agreements that really gets into the nitty-gritty of what goes into a PPA, the clauses, how it's negotiated, and certain calculations relating to termination payments or payments for energy. And then the third book in the series that was drafted just earlier this year is on power project procurement, and it goes over different frameworks and methodologies for countries to consider as they think about how they want to procure energy. One thing to be aware of about these handbooks is that they're not intended to be prescriptive. They're not intended to be instructional guides or to prescribe templates. It's just intended to share concepts, best practices, and consideration points, and to provide the rationale for why certain things are the way they are. So for example, we often get asked, why do governments get asked to provide guarantees from governments that may not have had a track record of doing IPPs or PPPs before? And so this book attempts to explain how does that fit into the larger piece of risk allocation, and what are options for governments to consider when they're thinking about what type of credit support they may want to provide. We wrote this book, as might be apparent from my remarks, with a public sector audience in mind, but really it's intended to be accessible to any audience, including someone who doesn't feel like they are a quote unquote finance person. And I've actually been told by several banks and private equity firms that they have used our handbooks as just pre-read materials for new associates joining their companies. So I think it has relevance beyond just the public sector. So the book discusses a number of key concepts. They're written on this slide. And so, you know, I encourage you to, as I mentioned, download a copy of the book, and you can flip through the table of contents and see if any of that would be appropriate for you. And some of the key concepts I wanted to talk about in a bit more detail are, we actually start the book not presuming that power projects are necessarily going to be structured as limited recourse finance, that is project finance transactions, but rather we explain what are different types of financing frameworks that a government can choose to adopt to procure energy. So along those lines, we discuss, you know, that a sovereign government is always welcome to fund its own infrastructure. And this is what we call host country financing. And there's a graphic depicting the basics of what that means. Essentially, it means a sovereign entity will use its own treasury funds to fund a power project. And we talk a little bit about, in the beginning chapters of the book, what does that mean and what are the strengths and weaknesses. And one of the key weaknesses to keep in mind is that many of the markets in which we operate, particularly when you're speaking about markets in sub-Saharan Africa, don't have unlimited budgets for expensive infrastructure undertaking. And they have a lot of other priorities, whether that be education, other types of non-power infrastructure, investing in SMEs, managing healthcare in their country. And so power may be one of many competing priorities for a sovereign. A second type of financing option is to approach a large, you know, project developer and have them fund the development and construction of a power project using their balance sheet. This is typically also known as corporate finance. And the biggest difference between corporate finance and project finance is corporate finance is financed using the cash flows and assets of an actual corporate entity, that corporate entity's balance sheet, whereas project finance creates a separate project company and funds a project using just the cash flows and assets of that project company. And I think, you know, the things to keep in mind with respect to corporate finance are that you don't often see it in the power project space, because power projects are very expensive and there are few corporate sponsors that are willing to take this kind of risk on their balance sheet. A third type of financing structure that we describe before we really delve into power project finance is resource-based infrastructure financing. What this essentially means is country on the continent can go to a foreign government and say, can you please build the following type of infrastructure, following power plant for me? And the foreign country may say, we'll do that in exchange for certain natural resources, whether that's exploration rights or for proven resources. And you can again see the graphic that kind of explains this concept. I think while this may be a speedy way of procuring power for some countries, it can be a bit tricky because it's a little bit less transparent than paying cash. It can be difficult to assess the cost of what you're giving to the foreign government. And also, it can be difficult for a host country to really assert control over how that project then gets built. And I know for those of you on the phone who work on the continent, there are many examples of this taking place in Africa, and I think there have been mixed reviews. And so this is really a type of financing method that may have its place in Africa, but it may not necessarily always be an optimal result. In some cases it may. And then finally, this fourth slide is intended to just depict the basics of power project finance. And again, I presume there's different experience levels on the phone, so I don't want to come across as too prescriptive or as if I'm teaching a lesson to those who may be experts themselves. But really what this is intended to show is what's unique about power project finance is that you have a large corporate sponsor or perhaps a smaller corporate sponsor that creates a separate legal entity called a project company. And that project company is essentially the legal entity that is seeking financing and that is constructing the power project and entering into the various agreements with government and with the utility. And this has its benefits from the perspective of not entangling the sponsors in all of the legal obligations of the project company. It also has the benefit of being able to, you're able to fund a project based on the merits of that project, based on the diligencing the project company and looking at really the cash flows of the project that's intended to be constructed. The weaknesses are, of course, there's a lot of different contracts that are involved. There's a lot of parties that are involved, and that can slow things down. And all of this, of course, adds cost. And I think you can see, if you compare this diagram to the earlier diagrams, there's a lot more arrows and a lot more rectangular boxes in this one. So that kind of gives you a visual depiction that while power project finance may be an effective way of funding infrastructure in a particular country, it can also be quite complex. So the book kind of gets into the basics of, actually, I'm going to go back one slide. The book kind of gets into the basics of how the project company interacts with the sponsors, with the government, with an off-taker, with lenders, with suppliers, and with other contractors. And we talk about how each party, how risk can be allocated among the parties, and how risk is priced. And the other thing we sort of go into is all the different entities that have an interest in the development of a power project by a private sector project company. And this next slide intends to just show you some of the relevant players that are involved in power project finance negotiations. As you'll see, for example, when we list government, we're not just talking about a monolithic entity. There's many different ministries that may have a critical role in power project financing. For example, while the Ministry of Energy may be playing a key role in setting energy policy and in granting licenses for the construction of a project, if a government is going to be expected to provide some sort of financial contribution or credit support, the Ministry of Finance is often involved. Moreover, if there's legal agreements the government is entering into, the Attorney General's office may be involved. So this is all to show you that there is no, when we speak of government, there is no monolithic entity. If you're talking about a state-owned utility, that's another extension of government in some respects. So really, there's a lot of different players in this process, including, regulators and so forth. This next slide shows you some of the non-government actors that are typically involved in power project finance transactions. We show the different categories of funders. At the most basic level, you have the equity providers and the debt providers. You also have a number of entities who are actually constructing the power project, who are providing operational support for the power project, who are supplying the equipment. And so once again, the key takeaway here is there are a number of different players. And also one thing to note is there's no monolith when it comes to financiers, particularly in emerging markets. There is a critical role that development finance institutions play in providing capital and providing certain types of financing that the commercial sector may not be willing to provide, perhaps out of worries about risk levels or constraints on their balance sheet in terms of tenor or amount needed needed in funding. And then finally, at the bottom of this table, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, in addition to just those who have a financial stake in the project and the government, there's also a lot of community actors that have interest in power project development. The thing about power is really impacts all of society. And so oftentimes, an NGO may have a critical stake in whether a power project is developed. And this is often the case where there are environmental or social ramifications where a project is being constructed. And I don't just mean fossil fuel construction, but it couldn't, a large hydro project may involve relocation of people who are settled in the surrounding area, or it may affect the water supply downstream. Similarly, you also, of course, have your end customers who are going to purchase this power, and they also have an interest. This next slide just depicts sort of the key theme in structuring a power project finance is really identifying what risks exist in a project and who is best placed to take those risks. And I would say a good way to think about what is optimal risk allocation is identifying who is best placed to take on a risk and their risk tolerance, and then trying to find a way of structuring the risk to along those lines. And what this basically shows, what you'll see in this drawing is that while some risks are within the purview of a government or within the purview of a developer, there are other risks that are simply uncontrollable. There could be a riot or an act of terror or a terrible natural disaster that burns down a plant, and those things are often referred to in legal terms as force majeure. So when discussing risk allocation, it is important to keep in mind it is impossible to entirely de-risk any project. So the meat of the book, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, was really to really explain the fundamentals of power project finance and to really speak to the public sector in emerging markets about why power project finance structures may be something they should consider as they think about how to procure energy for their constituents. And one of the key areas in any power project finance negotiation tends to be, what is the role of the government going to be in terms of giving comfort to a project company? And when I say that, what I mean is, if you're selling power to a state-owned utility that is then onward selling to a customer base that may be considered of mixed financial and economic capability and have limited disposable income, you're inherently selling power to a utility that you may be worried may not be able to pay its bills. And so what you'll often see in power project finance negotiations, or what I should say is what you'll inevitably see in power project finance negotiations where there's concerns about the off-taker not being able to afford the power that you're supplying, is there will often be a question to put to the sovereign government or the national government about, what can you do to make us more comfortable with selling power to this utility? And what you'll typically hear discussed is the government going to provide a guarantee? Meaning, is the government going to backstop the obligations of the utility? And there are many different ways governments have chosen to treat this issue. Some governments have provided government guarantees. For those of you on the phone who are from South Africa, you may be familiar with the REI-PPP program in South Africa for the procurement of renewable energy, where the government of South Africa provided a guarantee from National Treasury, backstopping the utility Eskom. In other countries, the government isn't willing to backstop the obligations of the utility with a wholesale guarantee. And that may be for a variety of reasons. The government may have a number of other obligations and it may not be able to take on an additional liability. They may be concerned that that liability will impact how much debt they can get from the IMF and other sources. And they may be worried that, you know, they're not in fact able to meet the obligations of the utility. So there's different structures for sovereign support. I list a few of them. There's letters of comfort, letters of support, and this is a hot topic in power project financing, mostly because many African countries are looking for solutions that don't necessarily require a wholesale guarantee, but will allow projects and funders of projects to be comfortable that the project company will be paid for the power it produces. And so we have a pretty extensive discussion of what these different types of government support structures can look like and how they vary legally and why one may be more suitable than another. Finally, so again, I encourage you to look at the book if this is something you might be interested in using either as training material for yourselves, for your colleagues, or for in your own line of work as you interact with people in the power project space. I want to kind of highlight how Power Africa has leveraged this handbook and the companion handbooks. Through our program, we provide a fair amount of capacity building and technical assistance to different African governments. We have teams across sub-Saharan Africa, and governments will often come to us when they're doing a procurement for the first time, or maybe not even the first time. They're experimenting with renewable energy and they're new to that technology, or they've done and they've had an IPP in the past and they weren't pleased with the experience. They may come to us and say, you know, we want to better understand the ins and outs of power project finance. And so we will actually use the handbook as sort of a baseline training guide for customized workshops and trainings for the public sector. And we do this in partnership with the Commercial Law and Development Program, which is part of the United States Department of Commerce, as well as the African Legal Support Facility, which is incubated by the African Development Bank. We've done a few of these trainings, and each training, you know, really varies based on who the audience is, what the purpose and objective is, and you know, what their level of sophistication with respect to some of these concepts is. So for example, last year we did a power financing workshop in Kenya, where we didn't so much as discuss the basics of power project finance. Rather, we spoke about different capital market structures, different JV structures that may work for freeing up capital or crowding in private sector capital to supplement public funds from the generation company, or rather funds from the generation company. We spoke about financing structures for transmission, and as well as how the distribution company there has been able to raise capital. So really that was a very bespoke training that borrowed some of the concepts we discussed in this book. And with that, I am pleased to hand over the microphone back to Anna and to the other speakers, but I hope this was informative. And if you have any questions about Power Africa, about the handbooks, which are searchable on the internet and you can download them for free, I'd be happy to follow up with anyone. So please feel free to email me.
Thanks, Bev. It was indeed a very useful and very enjoyable presentation. So thank you for sharing the handbook and also how it is used with us and with the audience. It is my pleasure. Before I introduce our next speaker, just want to borrow also on your words, saying please do send your questions to us using the chat box. We'll be happy to collect them and share afterwards during the Q&A. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Rentje van Tonder. she's joined Standard Bank in 2014 with a focus on developing and implementing strategies for Standard Bank to be a leading funder of renewable and other power projects in South Africa. Previously, Rentia has worked for the Industrial Development Corporation in South Africa in economic research. And Rentia, I know last time we spoke, personally at least, you were very eager to share your experiences and thoughts on how to make energy project bankables. So I am very much looking forward to hearing firsthand how we can do that and get the support of commercial banks.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to participate today. Maybe just a few words of introduction from the bank side. Many of you may be well familiar with Standard Bank. We're a commercial bank operating across 20 African countries, mainly within sub-Saharan Africa. We're very active on the continent with regard to the power sector, and I'm looking after most of the countries we're dealing with, and we're very close partners with Power Africa. And I think it's very, very opportune time to actually talk about this topic, because we believe that there's so much opportunity that we can unpack going forward. So I'm not going to be too technical. I'm going to give you a commercial bank perspective and just give you a sense of, what we believe are important in order to unlock funding in these projects. So my first slide is really to give you a sense of what is bankability and how do we look at it from a commercial bank perspective. And I normally say to clients, the easiest way to question whether the project has reached bankability is to check whether you will be able to secure equity and debt funding on the basis that you've developed the project to a point that the lender is prepared to actually engage and offer terms to the project. So when we look at bankability, I think Vic spoke a lot about risk allocation and where you have to address the different pockets of risk. And I think leading up to bankability, certainly, risk identification, the assessment of the risk and how you mitigate the risk is absolutely critical. And then, of course, the allocation of risk. Lenders typically will push the risk to the different project parties and the different participants and will not take undue risk, especially commercial banks. And I think in many cases we are being criticized for not taking additional risk from a funding point of view. But I will share with you some of the key things that we're looking at and why it's important, which will give you a better sense of why sometimes, banks are seen as being difficult. My next slide is just giving you a sense of project finance. And again, not repeating what Vic was presenting earlier, but I think the key thing for me that stands out is the fact that, you're not looking at balance sheet funding, you're looking at non-recourse or limited recourse funding, where you look at the underlying cash flows of the business, of the project, through an SPV structure, to be able to fund the project and to pay back the debt and the equity finance. Now, I think the one point I want to highlight here is that it is quite a tedious process. I can give you examples where it took us 7 years to go from bankability to final financial close. And there's many reasons for that. I think project finance is complex. It takes time to get, all the different advisors in place and get the different views and documents to be able to close the project. So the setup costs are high, but I think the benefit for the sponsors ultimately is the fact that it is limited recourse and you can effectively raise long-term debt in a project finance structure that is more attractive for the different players around the table. Again, project finance is through the SPV, the project company, with different players around the table, and I will talk to how we see the different players coming together, taking different risks, and what are the key documents we focus on. So you'll have the shareholders, you have the lenders. We normally, look at the EPC contract that address all the risks from a potentially a RAP document. We look at interface risk with the contractors, and then of course you have your O&M contractor, very important. And as per earlier comments, the government and also the framework in which the regulatory approvals are obtained are extremely important. And that's why, for power projects, it's very important to have those players around the table and for the lenders to get comfort around the process that's been followed. My next slide is to give you a sense from a lender where typically, we dissect the risk and how we see the different pockets of funding actually coming into play. So typically you will have the first phase of a project, and this is, more general in terms of project finance and whether this is a mining project being developed or a power project or infrastructure project where you do a detailed feasibility study with all your environmental and social assessments being done. Normally during this phase, you spend a lot of high-risk capital. It's mainly funded through equity. And you normally make sure that during this phase, you prove the concept, you've proved that this is a bankable project with the necessary technology review, as well as the permits and licensing being done. Specifically, one of the key focus areas in Africa around our projects more lately has been the environmental risk assessment and also from a social point of view, assessing the communities, the land assessment, what is available. You will find that this is probably definitely not where a commercial bank would like to participate, and you normally have, equity risk capital acquiring high risk, with a high risk appetite, but also a high risk return award here. And this is, definitely not where a commercial bank would like to play, but sometimes you will have a DFI having specifically finance available for feasibility stage funding, and maybe Lucy could later on mention that or refer to a DFI's role in this type of financing. The next phase is when you reach the point where you have a bankable project and you go into construction. So the typical risks you have there is time overrun, you have capital costs that may overrun, and also environmental and social risk. And I can refer to one or two projects where we had a problem. More lately, Kinangop in Kenya, where we started actually building the project, and it got to a point where the EPC had to withdraw from the project because of issues around social risk, where the community was not happy with this project. And with hindsight, a question around the bankability of the project and the work done leading up to that. But this is where, a commercial bank like us believe that we have that risk appetite. We come in, we structure the projects properly, we understand the role of the EPC and how we would like to address those. And the next phase is probably where you would like to see most of the financiers, where it's operational risk. The project has reached commercial operation date and it's actually operational and increasing its revenue base because it's actually producing and selling into the grid. These type of phases, as you move into these, you try to diversify your funding mix, and normally what commercial banks do is they reach a point where they're comfortable that they can sell down the debt, and this is where, we at the bank have done quite a bit of work to crowd in your typical asset managers who are providing debt platforms and want to buy from commercial banks. The commercial banks most probably will never exit this phase because the asset managers and debt providers through long-term pension funds normally would like to have a commercial bank still involved. So this is just giving you a sense of the three phases of which a project normally goes through and the type of funding available. I just want to move into, critical documents and why it's important for a commercial lender. And I think the absolutely key underlying document for a power project is the PPA. And again, I think Power Africa has done excellent work in unpacking what is required in understanding PPAs through their handbook and workshops that they've run. But from where we sit as a lender, this is something that we normally ask for right at the point where a project company engages with us and say, listen, we've raised the equity, we got our project, it's bankable, we want to sell into the grid, and we got a PPA from a utility. So we would like to see that that PPA is bankable. Normally we require take or pay, or at least some sort of capacity charge in the structure of the tariff. We normally look at the creditworthiness of the off-taker, and to be honest with you, this is where most of the power projects or large-scale power projects in Africa sometimes lack, bankability because of the current or potential challenging situation some of the utilities are currently finding themselves in. So that's when, you normally look at alternative type of structures and support to support the bankability of the power purchase agreement. The next agreement that is critical for us is the EPC contract. We as banks normally require a turnkey project, so one could argue that that sometimes is more expensive. But the reasoning behind that is a bank do not want to leverage on its step-in rights and actually own a project, and that is the last position that any bank would like to be in. So very important for us is that we have a credible and reputable, strong contractual EPC provider that has the ability to stand behind the project. And if you think of a large scale, to use an example, CSP project that in dollar terms could be as big as, $5 billion or $3 to $5 billion, depending on size, you want to make sure that you have a credible EPC that has the ability to provide the necessary performance bonds and stand behind the project, even if there's a delay or some sort of challenges during the construction of the project. So equally important to us is the interface risk, and we normally try and address that through the EPC and PPA contracts, which also a very good example is more recently what we've experienced in Lake Turkana, where we had a very good executable project ready to produce power into the grid, that we find ourselves that the transmission line was not built in time and ready to take the power, in which case, the risk shifts to the government who's supposed to pay deemed energy payments. So those are the type of interface risks that you try and manage through the contractual framework, which includes the EPC contract. I think the next agreement that is critical, and not only the agreement, but the participants as well, is the operations contract. So we're looking for an O&M contractor and suitable contract that allows you as a lender to be comfortable with the risk that you may face if the operator is not, best suited to run the project. So we do a thorough check and we look at the roles and responsibilities, the skills and the experience, and also the ability of that O&M contractor to stand behind certain replacement costs if there's poor performance, to be able to step in, and those type of risks that we as a lender do not want to assess. I also think in some power projects you have a fuel supply agreement, and to mention a few, you may have a big coal project that need a coal supply agreement. You may have a biomass project that need a biomass feedstock agreement. So very important for us there is to evaluate, the fuel supply agreement, whether the tenure of that agreement matched the PPA. So bear in mind, if you've got a 20-year PPA and you've got a 5-year feedstock supply agreement, the debt that you may raise on that contract may only be 3 years, and that does not make sense from a funding point of view, even the feeding through to the tariff that you would be able to bid. So key considerations certainly for a power project with a fuel supply feedstock element to that is the tenure and the terms of that agreement. We have some cases, where these two didn't match up, and we had to go back and tell the client, rather delay your project, but make sure that you have the minimum offtake that will support the lender's base case to be able to repay the debt within the covenants proposed. We've just spoke a lot about the government support and the underlying role of the sovereign. Again, an absolute critical role where you have off-takers being the utility 100% owned by the government, where you're effectively exposed to sovereign risk. The ability of the government to stand behind it. I think what we see currently in Africa is a tendency for governments not to provide direct support through a direct agreement, standing behind a guarantee structure to support the utility, but rather leaving it to the financiers to find ways to be able to structure around the risk. Now, if you look at the type of examples that I mentioned here, for example, MEGA, to cover your political risk through an insurance product, it sometimes do add to the, or most of the time, add to the cost of the project, which are being fed through to the tariff. So most important here is to find a way to be able to address those payment risk through structuring. We normally structure longer-term debt service reserve accounts to support a delay in payments up to 6 to 12 months. We have an example currently in Mozambique with a sizable IPP project with some short payments from the local utility, and I think it's sometimes we realize the importance of having the World Bank around the table to assist us to negotiate with the government or with the relevant players around the table to be able to find some solutions going forward. I'm not going to talk too much about the bankability requirements of a PPA. I mentioned that earlier, but I think it's important to mention that this is the single one important document if you want to just quickly have a quick quiz of the project and see how far it's developed. We normally look at the tariff structure and the dispatch side, the currency of the tariff, which is also important for a debt funder. If you have the tariff being set in hard currency, US dollar, but the local utility effectively collects its receivables through local currency, then you may have a mismatch. And how you need to structure around that, which sometimes creates liquidity issues for the utility to be able to pay back the loan in hard currency. So these are the type of, just practical challenges that you have in a project when you structure it and fund it. Also, the transmission and distribution connection, the timing and the curtailment around it, the credit support of the off-taker and completion risk, very important. You don't want to find a project being delayed, which adds to the cost. Also, how do you deal with seller default and buyer default? Also provisions around natural force majeure and political force majeure. And I think an important one that we as lenders face in Africa is there's a potential change in law. How do you protect yourself against that? And in many cases, when we negotiate for these type of clauses, we also negotiate on behalf of the shareholders to make sure that the sponsors are also protected, which is a very important consideration. I've included some case studies, and again, I'm not going to talk through all of them, but maybe just so that you can get a sense of what we've done. This is just high level, 118 megawatt gas to power project we structured in Mozambique called Gigawatt. It was funded with political risk insurance and the MEGA cover. The off-taker is EDM. You will see there the minimum cover ratios, what level of debt was included, and also the gearing ratio, which is normally quite important for the sponsors to understand to what extent they need to contribute to the equity structure of the project. Another project that I've mentioned earlier was Lake Turkana. That was only 2 commercial banks participated. That was Standard Bank and Nedbank from South Africa, and we participated under a commercial tranche with EIB, a senior loan and a loan A and B, where we effectively have had protection through an EIB guarantee facility. And this is also an important point that I just want to leave with you before I conclude, is that in these projects you need to understand that commercial banks and DFIs are not supposed to compete. So we complement each other. We find risk allocation in a way that we could be both MLAs, mandated lead arrangers, but actually share risk in a way that we can maximize the benefit to the various sponsors and make the project more affordable in a way that we split the risk as per your risk appetite. Yeah, so I think that was in a nutshell quite a bit of information. You're more than welcome to look at the presentation going forward and post questions or even email me if you would like to do that. And certainly I'm looking forward to engage with you more. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Renja. Again, a very informative presentation. And we are receiving questions from the audience, and I just want to remind you to continue doing that. As you know, Increasing Connections, this webinar series has been developed upon the requests of you, our members, in terms of the desire to learn more about the finance sector. So please do take this opportunity to continue sending your questions. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Lucy Chege. She is the head of Energy, Environment and Information Communication Technologies at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. She has led DBSA's team in originating and executing several energy projects which have received international awards and added more than 2,500 megawatts of power to South African national grid. Lucy, I understand we have you on the line, and I would be passing on your slides, so please just signal it when it's time to change pages. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anna, and thank you to the Women in Power Network for providing me this opportunity to give this presentation during this webinar. I think I just want to start by just introducing the DBSA briefly for those who are not aware. I think you can move to the next slides. Anna, you can move on to the next one. So we're just going to talk a bit about DBSA just to introduce, and then a lot of this has been covered already by Vib and Rentia about project finance and their considerations. So my task really is to give an overview based on our experience of the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program in South Africa, and also just to highlight some of the key issues that we as a DFI would look at. So if we move to the next slide, just to introduce DBSA. DBSA really is a DFI that operates in Africa. Although we are Development Bank of Southern Africa, our mandate extends to most of the continent. And we look at a couple of areas in terms of financing, project preparation, and implementation support for projects. We have investments in the energy sector, which range from the actual building of the power stations to transmission lines and distribution, and actually installation of gas pipelines. If we move to the next slide, we'll see that we have certain focus areas on the next slide. So we have 4 key focus areas: that's energy, transport, ICT, and water. Those are our main focus areas, but we also look at social sectors such as education and health projects. So I'll just jump straight into the next slides, which then go to what we are here to discuss. That's about project finance. Again, just as Vib said, I think the important thing is to, go to the handbook. It's got quite a lot of detail in terms of the fundamentals of project finance. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but I just want to point out 1 or 2 things in terms of what is key, because then it would affect also our assessment as a DFI of a transaction. So if we can move to the next slide. Essentially what we look at, really, we have to pay close attention to the cash flows, because that really is our primary source of repayment. And we are aware that most of it it's really not non-recourse, but it's limited recourse to the sponsor. So you have to pay keen attention to the contractual structure, which is similar to what Vib showed us. Most of the deals really in the power sector, I think, have been done on a project finance sector. Yes, there are a couple of corporate finance deals, but again, they're just way too large to do on a corporate basis on scale. So if we move to the next slide, we'll see there, I've just put an example of a project finance structure. And what I wanted to highlight on this slide is about the project company. I think we've talked a lot about the interlinkages and the various stakeholders. Within the project company, there could be a need to have several shareholders, and very often because the government is signing the PPA or the concession contract, they will in many cases have a requirement that grouping in the project company in terms of the shareholders would need to have some local shareholders. And that's an important point I just wanted to make on this slide, because it then affects our considerations as a DFI and the type of support that we can then offer to make sure that the structure works. Because many of the banks could provide lending to the main shareholders, but in terms of providing equity to the local shareholders, it's a difficult proposition. And I'll take you through our thinking process around that when I come to the renewable energy program. So we can move to the next slide. So I just want to introduce the RIPP because this forms the basis of the discussion that I'm going to have here today. Because within this program, we've had a number of project finance deals. I think it's quite a lot within a short span of time. And it has given us quite a clear view in terms of what needs to be done in the preparation of the program, both as a lender to the projects, as a supporter or lender to the equity investors, that's the local shareholders, and also in terms of what we look at from a development impact point of view. So if we move to the next slide, just to give a background, I mean, the main backbone of the RIPP program really is the Integrated Resources Plan for the country. This is currently being updated, but it essentially forms the strategy for the country in terms of what needs to be done for new generation capacity. So there was a big push to do this, and renewable energy was expected to increase by about 42%. And if we just move to the next slide, the program has managed to attract quite a lot of investment, and we can move to the next slide. It has attracted approximately over 100 billion in investment, and many of these projects were done on a project finance basis. A few are done on a corporate finance basis, but not many. So our role on this slide, what I wanted to highlight, one of our key roles here was really to assist with the Black economic empowerment players and local community trusts that needed to be shareholders within the project company. So the government had a distinct drive, and they had a distinct strategy to make sure that the project company is not just composed of essentially big players, but also has local players involved in it. So we played a role in terms of providing funding to those entities so that they could be involved on an equal footing. And I'll discuss a little bit in terms of how we did that on a project finance basis in the next slides. So we can move on. So in terms of the considerations, many of them are similar to what Rencha has mentioned, because there needs to be a backbone in terms of what you look at. But I think one thing I wanted to highlight in this first slide about the regulatory and legal, for us it was important to make sure that essentially there was clarity in the regulatory environment. And what we did in order to make this happen is we worked with the Department of Energy just to ensure that the regulatory regime was ready for the independent power producers. And there needed to be some background work, because without clarity on the regulatory environment, then it would be very difficult to get a bankable transactions. So there was a lot of background work that we did before even the program started. In terms of the procurement system, I think this is also key for us. And this is one of the areas where we paid a lot of attention and assisted the DOE, just to make sure that it was transparent, competitive, and fair. Because without that, then I don't think there are lenders that would be able to lend in a, to the projects. So we had to go through the regime just to make sure that we assessed the system that was being used, and made sure that indeed it was really transparent and fair, because without that, then your contracts can then be overturned and you can face all sorts of legal challenges. And essentially, you'll find that people will not be keen to bank the deals in a scalable manner. So we paid a lot of attention to that. The terms of the PPA, again, Rensha has talked a lot about this, so I won't talk much about this. But the view there is really to make sure that the risks are allocated appropriately to the parties. The tariff regime was an important one, because when the program started, it started off with one set of tariff regimes, but over time it became a more competitive-driven regime. But that is important, that the stakeholders understand what is being proposed. And that could take quite a lot of dialogue. I think we've seen that indeed there's been some questions in terms of the tariff. How was it determined? For example, in the first round, now we're in round 4, the tariffs look quite different. But it's important for the stakeholders to go through that process and to understand exactly what is intended. Here, the energy regulators are usually key, and they play a key role in terms of the stakeholder matrix and making sure that everybody is clear in terms of the tariff regime. Again, it's a difficult one because we know that usually tariffs can be very sensitive. So it's important to make sure that the right balances are struck and that those discussions go on as early as possible in the process and are continuously ongoing, because it's unlikely that that ends. However, once, the only thing we can say is that, once it is set, it would not be good to overturn commitments that have already been made. So it's important to spend enough time on this aspect so that commitments that are made can be, abided by. And contracting regime, that again goes to the structure that we saw. And in terms of the security as a lender, you want to make sure that you're secure, not only in terms of the security over the physical assets, but also to be secure around the contracting structure. So you want to make sure that whatever agreements that you have will really stand the test of time over time. We can go to the next slide. On the commercial point of view, again, I won't talk too much about this, but what I wanted to talk about here is that the government support and commitment is key, and I think that Vib has alluded to it. It's difficult to be prescriptive in terms of what comprises support, and each country has to make sure that it essentially takes a view in terms of what it wants to support. It could take the form of a backstop, or it could take hard backstop, or it could take the form of letters of support that we've seen in some countries. So, but it's clear that you need to have that in place. Then I just want to jump to technology, because this is a pertinent one. I mean, we as a DFI, we have many technologies that we get to see, and it's important that we manage the technology risk. And what happened in the renewable energy program, there were certain technologies that were indicated, that's PV, wind, biomass, and biogas, and small hydro. And that gives some certainty in terms of what technology we're going to look at, because technology risk can be very difficult to deal with. And however, it probably does not belong in this kind of a structure. You probably need to first have an innovative structure to look at the technology for some time, and then after that, migrate it over to a project finance structure once it is proved bankable. On the currency side, I think that the only thing I wanted to highlight there is that in South Africa, the decision was made to have the PPA in rands, and that assisted to basically mitigate any risks that could arise from currency fluctuations, because those would eventually affect the project cash flows. Then I just want to move on to the development impact, because this one is very key for us. As a development bank, we want to make sure that this has been appropriately considered, and it was one of the issues that we spent a lot of time just trying to make sure that we're comfortable with what is being proposed in the entire program. I think environmental issues, most people are fairly familiar with that. It takes the form of having an EIA and looking at the social impact assessment during the due diligence process. What was different in the renewable energy program is that there was a distinct drive on the local economic development criteria. And this was where actually the bidders were asked to propose within their projects to say, how are they going to deal with this aspect? And this goes to what I was talking about in terms of our inputs in supporting the players with funding so that they could secure their equity obligations. So these equity obligations were for the local empowerment parties, but also there were certain criteria around issues such as gender, making sure that it's all inclusive in terms of the people that are involved in the programs, because what we wanted to make sure is that the program also develops the country and provides broader benefits over and above delivering power. And still skills development was quite key. So we came up with a structure to support the local players in terms of the funding. And if we just move to the next slide, then I can just talk a little bit about what we did there. So the products that we could apply, I mean, the debt, I think Renche has talked a lot about that. But essentially, it has to be long-term debt. And in this case, it was 15 years plus ZA financing. The empowerment finance really is the equity finance that we had to support the local players in order for them to secure their equity obligations. Then the other product that we used in order to enhance the project really was the project preparation assistance. And this was what we applied in order to assist some of the companies with feasibility studies and project preparations, just to make sure that the projects were bankable before they get to the market. We also supported the Department of Energy with preparation assistance to basically prepare the program. So the next slide is just showing some examples of our experiences. I won't go into detail, but these are some of the renewable energy projects that we supported. The Ilanga 1 project there, we provided project preparation assistance together with the Industrial Development Corporation in order to make the project work. It was one of the first CSP projects. And the West Coast 1 and Jasper PV projects, there the important thing to see is that we provided the funding for the local parties and the communities in the projects to ensure that they could secure their equity obligations. So I'll conclude there. I think we've seen quite a lot of benefits. If we can just move to the last slides. So just in conclusion, I think, you know, if you use the project finance structure in an appropriate way, then you can have the necessary energy infrastructure provided, but at the same time, provide the much needed local economic development and benefits as skills transfer. So I'll stop at that, and hopefully you'll have some questions for me and you can get in touch with me as you wish. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. Indeed, we are already receiving some questions for you. So I do encourage our audience to continue sending their questions. I will just take a couple of seconds to change slides so we can continue with, or get started mainly with the question and answer session. And Vid, as you were the first speaker, I would like to share the first question with you. I'm going to read it, and it's actually two questions in one. So let me know if I need to repeat the question. It reads as follows. Can you talk about the limitations to project finance transaction generally when off-takers are not financially viable? For example, only 2 utilities in sub-Saharan Africa are financially viable, according to this comment. Can you also talk about the fiscal burden to the state when power prices are higher than the utility can afford? Many countries have IMF restrictions on sovereign guarantees for a good reason. Also important to distinguish between power projects that are at prices that even non-viable utilities can afford, often competitively procured, versus projects are that priced above what the utility is able to collect. So do you think you've had enough time to take all of this information? It's quite a big and long question.
Yes. Sure. Let me start with the first part, which I believe was about the limitations of project finance if you have an off-taker that may not be considered investment grade. So I think that's a really good question, in that this comes up a lot. And I don't think it's just relevant to project finance. I think if you sheet financed a transaction, you would still be exposed to off-taker risk. So I think this is a question that probably comes up whenever there is a private sector actor that is exposed to a utility that may or may not have as strong of a balance sheet and financial health as they would like. And so I think what we've seen in Africa is understanding that there's only, two investment grade utilities, I believe, in sub-Saharan Africa. I think what we've seen is a few things, and I think Rensha and Lucy may have something to say about this as well. But I think one thing we've seen is finance institutions have been really key players in power sector finance on the continent, because a lot of commercial banks, like Standard Bank, for example, may not be able to bear certain risks given that a project is selling to an off-taker with a strained financial health. And so I think while having a utility that isn't in the best condition financially may complicate sourcing financing, it has been done. And what basically happens is you end up having a number of development finance institutions that essentially are balancing, how much they are going to charge for a loan, or, how much risk they're willing to take with the potential development impacts. And so you'll see DFIs playing a big role here. You'll also see, this kind of precipitates the demand for support from the sovereign. If you're not comfortable taking risk on a utility, you'll often say, look, I need national treasury to back the utility. And that's when you'll get into negotiations about what kind of support is the sovereign government going to provide to backstop the obligations of the utility. You'll also see private forms of credit enhancement. We spoke a bit in all three of our presentations about the different types of sovereign support that's available, but you can also get credit enhancement or risk mitigation products from development finance institutions in the form of political risk insurance. You can, for example, in the form of a credit guarantee or partial risk guarantee from the World Bank, as well as on the private market. I mean, some of these products are available, they just may be more expensive in the private market. So I think what you end up seeing is a patchwork of different credit support instruments, which complicates the transaction, slows down deal negotiation times, and at the end of the day is why we at Power Africa are not only focusing on providing transaction support, we're also focusing on providing support to governments so they can plan what they need for their energy sector for the next 10, 20 years, build, the in-house capabilities to track their financing obligations, and come up with solutions that will make them more financially sustainable. So I hope that answers the first part of the question. I'm sorry you lost me on the second part, and I don't know if Rensha or Lucy want to add anything.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a little bit long, and I would like to maybe invite Rensha in case she has comments on this question, also because I do have a lineup of further questions for her at the moment.
I think maybe not to add any complexity to this, and the VIP answered it very well, but just to add maybe one comment. As financiers, we aim not to finance projects that we believe are actually too expensive from a tariff point of view. And I think, I'm not trying to say we try and discourage projects in general, but what we do as part of our evaluation process and due diligence is actually fully understand and appreciate the power market in a specific country in context of the utility and its ability to collect and to repay the debt. So a very classic example, maybe just to give you a sense of what we have done, is a recent transaction with the expansion of Kariba South with ZPC in Zimbabwe selling that power effectively to Manpower, where we went and we financed that transaction on the back of a ring-fenced escrow account from Manpower. So what we've done was we actually had the ability to ring-fence the proceeds from Manpower into a separate account before it goes back into the ZPC account and repay the loan out of that. So those are type of structures that we do see where we try and address cash flow questions around the utility, but at the same time, you know, we do evaluate the project in the context of the tariff that was agreed, and also what process was followed. Was it a competitive bidding process to determine what the terms of that PPA or tariff will be?
Thank you. And perhaps that's a very good segue to the question I have here in front of me, which is, how do you mitigate the interface risk with multiple EPC contractors?
How do I?
How do you mitigate interface risk with multiple EPC contractors? Is the question.
So I think that's the difference between an EPC and an EPCM contract. And banks don't like EPCM contracts. They prefer EPC contracts that are fully wrapped, where you have effectively one balance sheet and one EPC, taking the risk of that full EPC contract, and then have behind that, you know, potential subcontractors that they deal with them. A good example of where banks did move a bit away from the normal turnkey EPC fully wrapped context is in some cases with a split agreement with a wind project, where you may have a turbine supplier and the balance of plant being provided by a different EPC, and you have an interface risk agreement where you actually negotiate the potential interface risk and make sure that that is addressed. Obviously, you know, that does add complexity and in some cases some legal costs, but it is, in many cases you find that some sponsors are also either turbine suppliers or some sort of EPC, and they provide comfort around negotiating these type of interface agreements. But in other cases, you find that the EPC contractor are more than comfortable to do a full wrap and have already a structure set up with subcontractors where they manage that risk. So like I said in the beginning of my presentation, you know, commercial banks tend to lean towards, you know, taking less risk than because VFIs, and normally, you know, we tend to negotiate towards a fully wrapped EPC. A classic example in South Africa, which probably is not the one I should mention on this call, but is Medupi, done by Eskom on an EPCM basis with a whole list of subcontractors that they are managing, with not a single EPC taking the full responsibility of the EPC delivering this project on time. And you know what has happened in that project in terms of time delays, overrun, cost overrun. So the commercial banks just tend not to take that risk and prefer not to deal with that level of interface risk through an EPCM contract.
Thank you. Lucy, I want to have time to ask you at least a couple of questions. So I'm pretty sure you're still on the line with us. The first one is a very simple one and let me just pull it here. It reads, does DBSA's geographic scope include North Africa countries? The other question that we've received is in terms of the safeguards that DBSA has in terms of both supporting local economic development, but most importantly, ensuring that gender considerations are addressed through your portfolio. So I wonder if you can take some time to dedicate to those topics.
Yeah, sure. I think the first one, I can answer that. I think it's quite straightforward. So our scope currently we have a mandate to look at West Africa, East Africa, SADC as well, and South Africa, of course. But at the moment, we don't go to the Maghreb region. We're really focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the first question. So we wouldn't go into North Africa, not yet, until we have a mandate from the government to do so. Then the second question around the safeguards, if I can just move there. So I think for us, it's important that we have alignment in terms of what we do and what the government is doing. So the way we look at things is that we rather have dialogue with government and make sure that whatever goes into, we have our comments that are taken into account as early as possible in the process. And that's the way we make sure that there will be local economic development and things such as gender are taken care of within actual projects. Because what we want to do is to develop the program for the country so that when the projects are being done, they're done with that in mind. So it's not just DBSA that would come up very late in the day and say you haven't considered this. We want to act as one stakeholder group, so we give our inputs early on in the process. I think in the renewable energy program, we had dialogues to make sure that the local economic development criteria was spelled out. And we don't prescribe what the detail of that, because those are government policy decisions. But we then say what our views are in terms of how much emphasis would be put on that. And I think same with the gender considerations, just to make sure that indeed women are catered for and looked out for within the projects themselves. So that when it comes to a financing point of view, it's easier and we don't have to try and impose things, because at that point it's possibly quite late in the day. So rather to have ongoing dialogues and to follow the policy processes and try and influence it there, so that by the time the government wants to finalize on a policy, they have our considerations in mind. And essentially they're aligned, because we're basically an agent of, we're owned by the government. So we have alignment in terms of what we want to achieve. So that's how we safeguard the processes.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I'm sorry. Thank you, Lucy. I'm very conscious of the time, and which is, and for us, we are going to have to close the webinar. And I acknowledge the fact that we have quite an important number of questions we've not been able to address in the Q&A session. So to those to the participants, to our audience, we will try and coordinate with the panelists to make sure that we can provide you an answer to your questions one way or the other. So apologies for not having the time to ask the questions here, but we will try and follow with our panelists. And before closing officially the session, I would like to request our panelists to give us a takeaway message, the one thing recommendation that they want us to keep in mind. Viv, as we started the webinar with you, perhaps we can also start the closing with you.
Sure. So thanks again for allowing me to participate in this webinar. It's so nice to see women in African power convening sessions like this. Us women definitely need to stick together in this sector because we are definitely outnumbered. I think for me, a key message with respect to power project finance that I would recommend taking away is that project finance negotiation is essentially about negotiating risk allocation. And I think, to those who are members of the public sector who are exploring ways of negotiating IPP transactions for the first time, I think the key takeaway is really understanding and compromising on which risks you're best placed to take, and understanding why a project developer may want certain types of credit support or letters of comfort or letters of support and so forth. And from a project developer perspective, I think risk allocation also dictates from where you can source funding. A common request of Power Africa is often, a developer will come to us, they'll have a project, and they'll be looking for sources of financing. And I think when it comes to financing projects in African markets that don't necessarily have a long track record of IPPs or may not have a creditworthy off-taker. It's really being creative about who the different development finance institutions are that are active in this space, who the different fund managers are and what their risk tolerance levels are and what they're looking for, and how you can best engage with the different stakeholders to achieve a favorable outcome. So that's my takeaway.
Thank you very much. Rentia, if you could share with us your takeaway message, please.
Thanks. I think that summarized very well the issue around risk allocation, which I've also highlighted, but I want to just add to that and be very short. Is remember, we all want to develop Africa for the better part and lighten it up. So it's all about partnerships. You know, as a commercial financier, as you know, DFIs and developers as well as governments, I think we all want to succeed at the end of the day in having viable projects that can deliver power to the grid, and we will not be able to do that unless we have strong partnerships and understand the different roles and objectives. And certainly from a lender's point of view, you know, we would like to unlock that and take hands and work with the DFIs and the developers to be able to succeed.
Thank you very much, Rentia. Lucy, could we have your final thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I think I agree with what my two panelists have said. And I mean, for me as well, it's just the importance of, when developing the structure, to think about sustainability, long-term sustainability, in terms of, yes, managing the risks, working together with the partners, but also don't forget the issues about the development impact. You know, what legacy are we going to leave in terms of the local economic development, in terms of gender and so on. So it's important to keep all that in mind. It's very easy to talk about the other issues, and that could come later, but then it can affect the sustainability of the whole project. So it's important to keep that in mind. That's my takeaway.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank, again, all three of you for the great presentations and for your inputs. There has been quite an important demonstration of interest from our participants. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you to Power Africa for supporting the Women in African Power Network, and to you, our audience, because you've tuned in and made this a lively conversation. I don't want to close before inviting you again to our upcoming webinar on power purchase agreements, PPAs, towards the end of next month, April. So do keep tuned to our update email so that you have the right time and final date for the webinar coming up. On our side, we will be uploading the recording and the PDF versions of this webinar very soon, and you would all receive an email alerting you of the possibility of listening in again and taking a look at the presentations. It's been a pleasure hosting you today, and thank you very much again. Have a great day.